Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, we are so glad to have you. I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well. Thanks, Will.
Hey, and today we have back with us Bill Armaline. Oh, man, I did this last time too. I should have. Bill Armaline?
Armaline.
Dang it! I was
Armaline.
going to
Your
go with
fault, man.
Armaline.
It's spelled.
That's
it's
what I
spelled
was
to
going to
trick
say.
you. It's spelled to trick you, bro. It's
I
not
was
your
going to
fault,
say
man.
Armaline, so
Yeah,
thanks for making
all
That's
good.
embarrassing. Well, he's back joining us. And just a reminder who he is. He's a professor in the Department of Sociology and Interdisciplinary Social Sciences and the founder of the Human Rights Institute at the San Jose State University. And we're just so happy to have you back. So welcome back to the show, Bill.
It's great to be here, y'all. I had a lot of fun the first time. I'm psyched to be back.
Yeah, how the fires affect you?
They didn't affect me. I mean, we're good. We're far enough north. There was no air quality issues or anything like that. But of course, all our friends down in LA, it's still crazy. I mean, the biggest thing from the fires down there, honestly, is the effect on housing. Housing was already brutal. And you can imagine how much more brutal it is when a bunch of the housing stock just got burned up and insurance companies are jacking up their rates and everything else as a result. So, yeah, it's housing down there is a difficult situation for sure. But, our friends are working their way through it.
Yeah, man. And the last time we had you on, you really helped us have a better understanding of human rights. And I was looking to see when you were on. You were on back in November. This is before, I think it was before the election. And and I had asked you a question about, like, what do you think the state of human rights would be, if Kamala was elected and Trump was elected? And I'll be darned if I didn't get a chance to read what your answer was, but I'm going to guess it's not going to be very favorable. And I think if you turn on the news, you'll quickly understand why. So I'd love to just kind of before I get into some of the ICC questions and more in depth, just give me like a temperature check on where you think human rights is around the world in this new administration.
Sure. I mean, it's pretty dire. I mean, I can't really pretend otherwise. So this is an administration that, in my view and in the view of some others, is trying to get ahead of the declining empire in some ways. One of the ways that they're doing that is an attempt to kind of scrap some of the original game plan for American dominance and hegemony that followed World War II, which really is our involvement in international human rights, international law, and the extent that makes up what we have called the quote-unquote rules-based international order. Now, for, in many ways over the past several decades, that order has been quite beneficial for the United States and U.S. allies in the building of U.S. power all over the world, but also for global capital and not just the United States, but sort of the business interests around the world as well, and all these sorts of things. And we've reached an interesting point in U.S. and world history where the United States, and particularly this administration, is kind of starting to scrap some of that plan for U.S. power and hegemony. And there is a question of whether or not they're, like I said before, trying to get ahead of our kind of waning empire to establish sort of a new strategy, right? And that new strategy is looking like sort of trying to escape this role of sort of a U.S. hegemon that would have to be sort of responsible for things in the world, whether that's caring for crises, like the AIDS program that was established under Bush Sr. that was just closed down, these sorts of things, and instead return to kind of a realpolitik where it's just kind of might makes right, and we're only responsible for ourselves, and we're going to sort of re-entrench ourselves in our own hemisphere and in our own regions, to once again kind of reestablish that regional domination. And that's what, frankly, a lot of people thought that the Trump administration was kidding when they were talking about, taking Greenland, taking the Panama Canal, things like that. Folks like me did not take that for a joke for 1 second. and that's what all that is about, right? Is sort of retreating from this position of U.S. hegemony that works through this international-based, rules-based order, if you will, and then just kind of sort of turning on a dime on that. Well, not really on a dime, but over the course of a couple administrations, we've kind of turned on that and said, well, we're going to kind of be free of some of these previous obligations that allows us to just kind of play bully and play sort of like raw power politics, and kind of re-entrench in these sort of regional games. But there's a danger in all that, right? Just like there's a danger in the owning class doing what they're doing now with the federal government and with the state itself, really just taking the mask and the gloves off in terms of the privatization game and just selling it all on a fire sale. That's really good for short-term profit and power for immediate oligarchs, but it's real bad for the long-term sustainability of the capitalist system they depend on for their power and capital accumulation. This is what I talk about and other scholars talk about when we say that capitalists they get too greedy for their own good, right? They what they start doing is in that search for that short-term gain, that short-term bump, that short-term stock jump, that short-term profit. They cannibalize the very things that they actually need to sustain their long-term system, and that's a real dangerous place we're in right now. So yeah, to your question, in less words, Will, Trump administration is making no bones about their kind of retreat from our position in leading that system, and our retreat really from being key kind of funders for a lot of those bodies, whether it's the Human Rights Council, the WHO, and some of these other international organs that, unfortunately, I think a lot of people are pretty naive when it comes to how much everyone, not just Americans, but people all over the world, depend on some of those resources and some of those international institutions.
Yeah, man. So I would love for you to even go a little bit more in depth on your thoughts on, so what I'm kind of hearing what you're saying is like it's like this consolidation of power, this isolationism. Maybe I don't know if that's the right word. I'm pretty ignorant in a lot of these areas. What do you think is the end game behind some of these, like in your professional opinion, behind these things? Like, hey, let's take Greenland. Let's throw this thing out about Canada. Let's rename, Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America. Let's take. I mean, what is, I know you said people are acting like it's a joke. You don't think it's a joke at all. And I agree with you. I think if he can do it, he'll do it. That's kind of my philosophy on Trump. For good, better or worse, if he can do it, he'll do it. What can I dig into that a little bit more? What's going on in your mind without being a mind reader? What's the end game?
Yeah, well, Josh, I wouldn't say you're being ignorant at all, bro. I think these are really good questions, man. I think they're real honest questions too, that a lot of people are pretending they know the answers to that don't. So a lot of this is sort of educated speculation, but we can do our best. So first of all, on the taking of these various places, right? It has to do with the way that geopolitics are being perceived by this administration, particularly how geopolitics are being perceived vis-a-vis China. So one way that China has been growing their power all over the world is different than the way that we do. So rather than do it by planting military bases in everybody's backyard and penning in the world island with our Axis strategy, what China has done is kind of similar to what Spain and the Iberian Empire did in the First World Order, which is to establish order by establishing dominance of all of the sort of pinch points for global trade. So this is what they've been doing all over the world in terms of building ports, building their Belt and Road Initiative, which is basically building trade routes and establishing this infrastructure for sort of Chinese-dominated trade as a sort of soft power project. And they did that as the United States really abandoned all of those kind of soft power projects and all of that, even infrastructure building for our own domestic sort of society, communities, and so forth. This is what people have been waking up to in terms of China having all the high-speed rail, nice cars, and all the nice things, and we are stuck with a completely sclerotic, rotting infrastructure and frankly, society. And so this is sort of their perception, and their perception is not altogether wrong, right? And so they are not wrong in that China has been building their soft power influence all over the world by really dominating and attempting to dominate all of these pinch points for trade. And the Panama Canal is a very obvious pinch point for trade. Now, is it true that China controls the Panama Canal? No, that's bluster from Trump and his, loose lips. But what I'm meaning to speak to is really how they're perceiving geopolitics. And what I'm saying is that perception is not altogether not there, right? That is very much kind of in play. Now, Greenland speaks to some of that geopolitical perception, but it also speaks to something else, which is climate change. So there has actually already been an ongoing race by world powers, by great powers, particularly Russia and the United States, but not only Russia and the United States, for control of the Arctic. Now, this is because as climate change rolls on, all that ice is going away. And that creates new shipping lanes, trade routes, military channels, but also uncovers all kinds of natural resources. Some are the kind that we're going to kill ourselves by pulling out of the ground. Some of them are the kind that I talk about in my book in terms of these new 21st century resources that are needed to rule the next century, right? So Greenland has them both. Greenland has some of those old school resources, the fossil fuels, but they also have some of these really rare minerals and heavy metals and these sorts of things as well. So you better believe all eyes are on those resources as they are going to be unveiled through climate change. And again, I don't think they're kidding at all when they're ready to pressure former allies to give up some of that resource, or at least give up control of that resource.
That's really wild, and I didn't know that part about Greenland.
Me neither. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, I maybe speculated there's probably some larger nefarious plan to do it, but yeah, that's really wild. But I'm curious about the China angle, because you had mentioned something that I really wasn't aware of, that China does like their own kind of, I don't know, philanthropic or human assistance or something, humanitarian aid. There you go. I'll figure out this English language. And the fact that they're doing these things around the world for soft power, but also they exploit their workers, and they have this, seemed like this unfair economic advantage because they don't have like a Department of Labor or an OSHA or whatnot. So how those things seem to be in opposition to each other. Can you kind of help me make sense of why they could care less about their people, but they are out and about, spreading good cheer and
Sure.
kissing babies?
I'm going to push back a little bit. I would not agree that that the Chinese government and state does not care about their people. In fact, I think that China is cleaning our clock, frankly, when it comes to all kinds of things. And we might be, I think, a little bit um, um, affected by our own propaganda, all of us, right? In terms of how we see the way that we treat our workers in the United States, or the workers end up being treated in the United States, versus the way that everyday life is happening for Chinese citizens. So I'll say a couple things. First of all, is China sometimes full of shit with their propaganda? Yeah, just like every major power on earth. Does China absolutely have a labor that is exploited in the formal Marxist sense? Yes. Do they also have ethnic minorities, as much as they try and deny all of that treatment? And some of that is nonsense from U.S. propaganda, but some of it is not. Do they have these kinds of ethnic groups that they also exploit in the process of production and other things, and expropriate, so go further than exploitation to actually just take and theft and all of that? Yes, absolutely. We do all those things too. and all of those sort of let's say guardrails that you just mentioned in terms of OSHA and things like that are precisely the instruments and the institutions that the owning class continues to decimate as we speak. And frankly, the extent to which those organizations are still with us, they're only with us to the extent that the labor movement has made that so, right? And the same as NLRB, the same as the Consumer Protection Bureau that was just nixed or in the process of being nixed, I guess. So I would say that both in China and in the United States, these are questions of class warfare. These are questions of to what extent are working people in China or working people in the United States able to, right, to make political demands on their states and have those demands be met. Now, those conversations happen a very different way in China politically and in terms of speech rights and things like that. But I think we would have a very interesting conversation if we compared and we looked at what's successful and what is not between the two nations. And I think there's a lot to be learned there, which is why I think what you're going to hear from me most often is advocating we really have to get off of a competitive position relative to China, particularly at the level of civil society. And we really have to start pursuing deep and integrated cooperation. And I think that's really the answer for everyday people of both nations. Unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of trust in our respective owning and ruling classes to make that happen without us forcing them to do so.
I mean, this is like, I know we gotta talk about the ICC. That's what we, that what we were going to talk about. But this is so like challenging for me because, and maybe it is like what you're saying, this propaganda or whatever I've received. But there's this view in my mind that the average Chinese citizen is subjugated, right? That they are essentially under an oppressive regime, like a government that does not give them rights. Again, I've never been to China. I've met some Chinese citizens, and I am woefully ignorant as to the daily life of an average Chinese citizen. So kind of help me understand, because I just have never really heard what you just said before.
Yeah,
Not that I didn't think it was out there, but help me understand that a little bit more. That's a fascinating thing. And then, like, what would cooperation look like? You had mentioned some really intense, deep cooperation. What would it look like? And then
first
we'll
of all,
move on
I
to
love the
ICC.
question. I mean, I really do, and I really encourage you and your audience to check out all of the posts from. So there was a really interesting thing that happened. I'm working on writing something on this actually. So when the TikTok ban was threatened, right? And I guess it's still up for grabs whether it's banned, isn't banned. I don't know. I'm not a TikTok guy, so I don't know. But when that happened, right? You did have this moment where you had all kinds of young people, especially, but people really across the board joining Red. So joining not just a Chinese social media company, but a Chinese state-run social media company in Red. And what you saw in that really interesting, what I see as an absolutely fascinating sociological experiment playing out in front of our eyes, is all of those kinds of aspects of both Chinese and American propaganda breaking down as everyday people were just able to ask each other questions about their lives
Hmm.
and get to know one another and get to know. And I mean, some absolutely fascinating, but also some wonderfully heartwarming things were happening in that moment, and I think continue to happen through that exchange. And so here's the way that I would kind of put it, Josh. Like, so in my humble view, and obviously lots of people are going to have takes on this, and I have spent time in China. So I was a wushu athlete, sanso athlete for a long time in my early career, and I got to actually compete on the U.S. team representing us in China, and I would go train with our Chinese team and tons of Chinese teammates, and all of that. I have an absolute love for the Chinese people, Chinese culture, and all of that, and I always have, and I always will, and really, really value those experiences that I've had. But that also, frankly, gave me an opportunity to really peek behind the veil of Chinese propaganda to see both then and now. Now, their economy has evolved a great deal in the past, 15 to 20 years, and since I used to spend a lot of time there. So quality of life has increased significantly, but it is still, very much an unequal society. I wouldn't say it's as unequal as the United States. We kind of are among the top in terms of wealth inequality, but China is also a deeply unequal society as well, if we're going to be honest. There are still large populations in China that work under what American workers would consider pretty challenging conditions. Not all American workers, but some American workers would consider challenging conditions, and some challenging pay, those sorts of things. However, some of the old patterns of the great migrations from the sort of rural east to the cities in the west has somewhat shifted as their economy and the way the economy works has somewhat shifted, and their middle class has grown significantly, as has happened in India and other growing powers, right? So I think the way that I would describe it is that we have greater freedom, certainly, when it comes to certain forms of political repression and speech and these sorts of things. But we could also talk about how those things are being squeezed for us too, right? We could talk about the extent to which those are just kind of like rights in theory versus rights in practice, right? Where they, frankly, clean our clock are on what we call in human rights social and economic rights. So these positive rights, the rights to housing. Check out the housing costs. I mean, when Americans, we would murder for the housing costs in China. And these are high quality, urban, modern, right?
How
Not
much?
like
How
when I
much?
was there,
I'm
right?
just
When I was there,
curious.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, like how much are we talking for housing costs?
It depends. It depends, but rental markets are certainly wildly lower because again they subsidize and there's all kinds of other things, and the way that their pay and housing subsidies works are frankly totally different from ours, and the way ownership works is a little different from ours too. But I was looking a little bit in Hangzhou because that's where I used to train and things like that, and I could afford. Well, let's put it like this: I can afford a place in Hangzhou. I cannot afford a place in San Jose, where I live and work and have been here for 17 years. I could buy a place in Hangzhou right now, really nice spot in a really nice city in China. I could not buy that
Airbnb
place.
it?
Oh yeah, I guess right. Well, they do not let you Airbnb there, right? That's not something they allow. But you see what I'm saying? And these are some of the things. And I bring up the TikTok thing because these are also some of the things that young people were flabbergasted by when they were talking to their young Chinese peers. Look at the grocery prices in China and the ability just to eat and live a normal life. Look at the prices and the quality of their EVs. Fam, if Chinese EVs were sold today in the United States, it would be the end of US car manufacturing. They would outcompete them immediately. Our cars are a complete joke, and I include Tesla, are in a complete and total catastrophic, laughable joke in comparison to what the Chinese are buying for a fraction of the price. Check out their main EV company produces a vehicle that they sell specifically to young adults. Fam, it's basically a Ferrari. I mean, the thing is basically a sports car that I'll never afford to drive. They sell it for $14,000.
Oh man.
Would blow the doors off of almost every EV on our market. That's their starter vehicle that they're selling to young adults graduating from college.
It sounds deadly.
There's a reason that they won't let any of these products, all these free market capitalists, there's a reason none of them will let any of these Chinese products into our markets, right? So yeah, fam, there are absolutely differences to be had, but it gets to be in a much more complicated conversation when we say it, and then what are the effects on our daily qualities of life? And I think there's a great deal to be learned from both populations, right, on how the other side lives, right? Yeah, I guess that's what I'll say there. I don't want to run on too long.
Yeah, that's I feel like if we were playing jazz, like I would just want to hang out there for a moment. But like I really need to ask you about the ICC now because there's been a lot of developments on that front since the last time we chatted. We didn't really get into it that deep, so let's just start there. Like, what is the ICC? Give us a little bit about the history and formation, who's involved.
Yeah, so I'm going to do it kind of like real basics, and just let me know if you want me to go further in the weeds. I just don't want to get boring for your audience, right? So, I think the best way to approach your question is to talk about the international courts and talk about the difference, right? So, there are two major international courts that, if you've been watching the news for the past couple of years, you will have seen, right? And the first is the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. Now, the ICJ is an actual body of the United Nations. So this is an entity that was created along with the UN Charter in mid 20th century, right after the Second World War. So the ICJ has been around for a long time. And the ICJ is where, for example, South Africa brought their case of genocide against Israel, and a bunch of other countries have since joined on, and all of this. And so why do that, and what's the ICJ? So the ICJ is the court that was set up to basically settle beefs between states, so they don't go to blows, so they don't turn to warfare. And that makes total sense if you understand the point of the United Nations and the UN Charter following World War II was, at least in part, to prevent nations from getting into another world war, where now that nuclear weapons were on the table, could end human civilization, right? Nuclear apocalypse. So the ICJ exists for what should be pretty obvious reasons, right? Which is to literally just be a mediator between states. The ICJ does not try individuals, does not try individuals of any kind for war crimes or anything like that. You need to think of the ICJ really just as a legal mediator whose job is to avoid warfare, right? To give states an option through which they can settle their conflicts, right? Diplomatically, right? Peacefully. Now, the ICC is the International Criminal Court. This was created in the 1990s under the Clinton administration with something called the Rome Statute that also established other things in international law and these sorts of things. And the ICC is the court that's set up to try individuals, right? So this is the court that can actually try individuals, leaders, military heads or generals, right? These sorts of folks for war crime, for the gravest of crimes, right? And so for international legal scholars, these grave crimes include things like war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, etc. Right? So these are only these massive, major international war crimes that the ICC takes up.
Yeah, real fast, Bill.
Yeah, go for it.
I didn't realize that ICC was created by the United States under Clinton.
So this is what gets really interesting about American exceptionalism and American hypocrisy in international law. So it's created, and not by the Clinton administration alone, right? The Clinton administration in the United States were very much involved in the creation of the ICC, which is established under a treaty and all of the rest. But just like we did kind of with regard to other human rights instruments and international legal instruments, what happened was we were a big part of creating this thing, because if you recall, at the time, we were involved in trying to help Europe and the rest of the world settle issues in the former Yugoslavia, right? So this is where you had, right, Milosevic and all of these folks, the Bosnian, Serbian, and Croatian kind of conflicts that got genocidal, right? That went wild, went genocidal. And if you recall, for any of our listeners that are old enough or have read this history, right, the Clinton administration and other administrations in the West were all trying to kind of deal with that international catastrophe. Now, we were also trying to do our own thing in terms of foreign policy intervention and all that too, but that's another conversation for another day. And so we become heavily involved in those discussions and in the actual formal creation of the ICC, because we were also involved, right, in trying to deal with that conflict. And if you recall, right, trying people from that genocide was one of the first acts of the ICC when it was established. So pretty clear, that's kind of what our game was, and that's kind of why we were involved. Now, what did the Clinton administration say, literally, as they was signing on to the as a signatory, but not ratifying, sort of, in other words, giving jurisdiction of the ICC for the United States? The Clinton administration said to the world, we ain't doing that. And made no bones about it. Really, I mean, this is kind of really what's funny about it. It's like, you'd think they'd have been subtle about it. They weren't. They come right out and said why. They said, we're not going to do this. And we're not going to do this because we know that if we do this, you're going to bring up military leaders and political figures in the United States up on war crimes. That's not going to happen. And so from the jump, we took a position of American exceptionalism, where again, this counts for everyone else, but not for us unless we tell you, with regard to the ICC. So that's always been the US position. Now, since then, administrations have been more or less kind or disruptive toward the ICC and the work of the ICC. And that has depended, frankly, on the politics of that administration and also on who the ICC was going after. So, for example, you'll note when the ICC is talking about going after Putin in Russia, we're all for that. And we were all for saying, hey, these are war crimes. Hey, these are crimes against humanity, which, by the way, they are, right? Calling balls and strikes as a human rights person, right? They absolutely are. However, when those things are attempted to apply to Israel, that's the worst catastrophe in the world and an abrogation of sovereignty and all, every bad thing you can possibly come up to say about international law and the ICC will say. And, as we have also done in the past under the Trump administration, but under others, even threatened to sanction and prosecute ICC prosecutors when they threatened to come in and investigate our involvement in Afghanistan and war crimes there. We said, oh, we're going to sanction your prosecutor. We're not going to let them come here. All of these other kinds of things. So the United States really from the jump has had this very sort of, again, with lack of a better word, hypocritical or let's say selective support of the ICC that depends
Selective. There you
upon
go. That's a nice
context
word,
and
Bill.
interest, right? So yeah, we could get into more specifics there, but I think that's the best way to understand our position relative to that court.
I think it's such an interesting thing to work to because it's something that, again, the average U.S. citizen is woefully ignorant of any of this, right? Even that there is an international criminal court or that it was created, right? Under probably a lot of people would say, that was maybe created sometime in World War II. And it's like, nope, 1998. You know what I mean? It was right. It's been since, the millennials have been here, the old frickin' millennials. And so I would love for you to kind of help us understand the effectiveness of the ICC. I mean, you've already kind of alluded to some of the constraints it might have, especially when trying some of these major powers that are like, nah, we're not going to do this. We're not going to play ball, especially the United States. But what would you say would be like the achievements of the ICC that you would want to say, hey, this has been some good that it's done? And then what would be the challenges and limitations that you've seen of the ICC?
Sure. And I think that's really the best way to answer your question, is to speak to strengths and limitations, right? So what are some of the strengths? What are some of the strengths of the ICC and of the ICC's power? A few things are, frankly, the strength of just simply investigation and the revealing of information. So the sort of antiseptic effect of sunlight, if you will. And so, for example, when war crimes in Afghanistan were investigated both by the Taliban but also of the United States, that did a great deal for the world in terms of just basically uncovering and showing it in real empirical fashion, right? Because these are legal investigations, right? These are very, very painstaking kinds of research and investigations that are done that are replete with data and receipts, if you will, for those that really want to understand more deeply what was happening in any of these places and what created those conditions or violations. So one of the things that ICC charges and investigations do is really dig deep into, the violations and what happened and who did them and how it occurred and on all of the rest. And that's very valuable information for all of us in the world that do this work and are concerned about preventing those kinds of violations. Secondly, at times, they have been successful in trying despots and other kinds of folks around the world, although as the criticism rightfully goes, these have tended to be, folks from African nations, folks from the global south, not people from any sort of great powers, right? Not people from Russia or the United States or Israel or others that have absolutely committed some of these high crimes but have never been held to account. So there have been some wins in terms of convictions. There haven't been very many, but there have been some. And even when charges have not led to convictions, they have also been effective at times in curbing some of those activities. But as a, as the sort of presenting both sides of the coin, the downside is the process moves incredibly slowly. So that also has kept many people from being actually held to account. And like I said before, the court has been, for all kinds of reasons that we get into if you like, unable to challenge the power of great powers that sit on the Security Council in order to bring that justice to the highest points in our world, which is frankly where it's most needed. So once again, you're not going to see any successful indictments of politicians or military heads in any of those great powers. It just hasn't happened.
Hmm.
Now, that being said, again, to kind of play both sides of the coin here, it doesn't mean that those haven't been completely ineffective. So take, for example, the charges right now against Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu and some of the other Israeli leadership, which, by the way, should absolutely be applied to American leadership, 1,000%, but that's another conversation. And look at what that means. So one of the big deals with Trump's sickening meeting with the war criminal Netanyahu in the White House is that he is exactly that. He is an absolutely wanted war criminal and fugitive to international justice, and it is actually everyone's duty to abide by those arrest warrants. Now, because we did not formally give jurisdiction to the ICC in the United States, we're in a bit of a gray area there. However, European nations are not. And so already there was a big sort of like dust up, we'll say, around Poland allowing him to fly through Polish airspace to get here and all those other things. And you'll note he is not scheduling trips to the EU. He is not scheduling trips to many of these other places in the world and cannot do so without absolutely risking his arrest. Because not everybody in the world is like the United States, and many other countries in the world have demonstrated their willingness to abide by those ICC obligations to arrest any war criminal that comes into their sovereign territory. And that includes Canada, by the way. So again, it's both a strength and a limitation, right? There are these warrants that go out, and it can very quickly curb where folks like this can plant their money, can travel, can allow their kids to travel or go to school or vacation or escape the war at home and all. So it's not that it does nothing, right? And these owning class and ruling class folks that are crying and screaming about how absurd international law is and all that wouldn't be doing so if they didn't see it as threatening to them, right? So I know that might be kind of an unsatisfying answer. It seems kind of ambiguous, but that really is the accurate read, right? There are some strengths to the ICC and reasons to really bolster it and keep it around and really try and make something like that work. And there are some really sort of fundamental criticisms of the ICC and its limitations that absolutely deserve to be addressed and would need to be addressed for it to really succeed in its mission.
I've got a couple different questions. Number one, like if Bibi Netanyahu is no longer prime minister, Israel, whatever, and someone else gets in there and, could that person decide to comply with ICC and then and send them off and away?
Well, the Israeli state would have to make that assessment. But the general condition that you're describing theoretically is possible, yes.
Got it.
So let's say, for example, Palestinian resistance succeeds, and Israeli liberal and progressive politics and resistance succeed against sort of Israeli Zionists and in the Israeli right wing. And you somehow, on the other side of all this mess, let's say 5 years or so from now, you spit out on the other side a more progressive Israeli state. that Israeli state, just like any state can make whatever decisions they like with regard to the international treaties to which and courts to which they are a party. If they do so, they can do whatever they like from there. Absolutely. Now, do I think that's on the immediate horizon? No. Right, but that's kind of a different conversation.
Yeah, and what involvement, if any, do you think the ICC would have if Trump actually decides to like do what he wants to do to get to Gaza, as he's publicly stated?
Sure. Well, the ICC itself will not be able to do very much to stop that, because again, the ICC depends upon member states to do some of that work for it, right? It's not like as if the ICC has like a international marshal service that it can go around and like kidnap and arrest, anyone who has a warrant, right? So,
Right.
and for obvious reasons, right? We can see how that wouldn't work. And as you may or may not know, from previous administrations, since the Clinton administration, there's also been a law passed in the United States that we will potentially use military force to free any of our own citizens or potential allies who are arrested and detained at The Hague or for a trial at the ICC. So we've even threatened, like, hey,
Wow.
we are willing to use force to back up our hypocrisy.
SEAL Team 6, dude?
I mean, I don't know what specifically we'd use. I mean, to be honest with you, but I mean, that is real law. That is a real thing. Now, to be honest, do I really think it would go down like that? No, for other reasons. But that it's going to be a different question as to what can stop what is really, I mean, you're not asking this a question, but I'm going to say it, is a plan that's seen as sheer lunacy by much of the world. I mean, and let me share as to why. Even many conservatives are calling me. I don't know how many of you listen to like Breaking Points or anything like this, but even like Sagar on Breaking Points was like, I'll be one of the hippies out protesting war if this happens. You know what I mean? Because even some of the conservatives are realizing that, like, you have this MAGA agenda that's claiming to be isolationist and, America first and all this kind of stuff. And here he just said that we would take on the greatest international crime and catastrophe created and mess in the world on US dollar with US boots on the ground. And we would, quote, own it and all these things. I mean, beyond that being wildly illegal in every which way, it is an absolute disaster for U.S. foreign policy for the foreseeable future. I mean, our diplomatic abilities in the Arab world or in any of the allied world in the South and the East would be destroyed, like permanently. That would be a mess that we would hold on to and have to deal with. It would make hanging on to our days in Afghanistan look like a recess, look like no problem, right? I mean, it's just an absolute disaster. But at the same time, like, was I surprised by it? No. The president's a con man real estate mogul. He is doing exactly what a con man real estate mogul would do in this situation, even surprising Netanyahu in real time with his announcement.
But Bill, just remember all the people that want to go have nice tourism of Jerusalem, and they need a place to stay. I mean, have you thought about them, Bill?
I mean, honestly, it really is. I mean, and I haven't seen today. I hope I'm not speaking out of ignorance, because literally as we speak right now, the meeting with the Jordanian kings is supposed to be wrapping up. So we'll see very quickly what Jordan thinks of this plan, because basically Trump's plan is send them all to Jordan, which would be the end of the Jordanian
or
state.
Egypt, right?
They're talking all kinds of nonsense. But the real, for the folks in the know that the real aim was Jordan. That the real aim is trying to pressure Jordan into taking it, because, and he thinks he can pull the strings on Egypt as well, and he probably can. I mean, this is one place where I think some of our, some progressives and lefties, I think a little bit naive or a little bit too hopeful about Arab leadership, and I frankly don't think Arab leadership gives a shit too much about the Palestinian people,
Hmm.
frankly. I don't. I think what they give a shit is the future of their own rule. So to the
Sure.
extent that they give a shit about this issue, it's more about like, what will happen to my rule if 1 million Palestinians come rolling over my border as refugees?
Yeah. I
And
mean,
what will happen to my own rule if I'm seen signing on with Trump to turning Gaza into a fucking condo development? Like,
a
this
resort
is
town.
really how they're thinking through it. It's unfortunately not this like Arab or Muslim solidarity for the Palestinian freedom, and I that is frankly naive. In the same way that it's naive to think that BRICS nations are not involved in many of these genocidal catastrophes, like for example, the UAE is deeply involved in the catastrophes on the African continent, right? So it's like this is the messiness of the world, right? But
Yeah,
yeah,
and it is messy.
yeah.
I was doing just a little quick research, right? We're in the age where we can go in and find whatever we want. It's amazing, but it also makes you feel like it's the Dunning-Kruger like effect, I think, in full
Yeah,
force, where you like a
I know
little and you feel like
everything
you
and
know a
nothing
lot.
all at once.
Exactly, dude. It's
Yeah.
so true. But when I was looking at this, and it says of the 30 plus cases the ICC has pursued, nearly all have involved African leaders. I would love for you to speak on what's going on. Is it biased against the global south? And maybe the answer is obvious, but is it biased against the global south? And what's going on there? Is Africa that bad? Or is it like they're trying to, like, does it have that many criminal leaders? Is what I mean? Or is it like this is clearly the result of bias and prejudice?
Yeah, I totally appreciate the question. I think the way that I would describe it is not necessarily bias. I think what I would describe has to do more with power. So, where are the places where um, leaders and sort of, let's say, political entities have the least amount of power to dissuade, obfuscate, distract, push away these kinds of international legal interventions? The answer there is in third world, right? What we used to call the third world, or the global south, or what we now call the less developed nations. Um, and I think that's part of what part of the reason there. I think another reason is that Africa has been, in terms of the international sort of, um, when you think about the focus of international elites all over the world, so the business class and political leaders that are also in their let's say cohort and service, um, uh, Africa has been a real a place of focus. Why? Because it is still the place that everyone wants to go to get the cheapest natural resources, and to do so um, in such a way that is seamless, that is without cost, without tension, without conflict, um, and all of those sorts of things. And so that's just created a great deal of, with lack of a better word, focus on the African continent by the international community, particularly by the elites, the powerful, those that make up the World Economic Forum and these sorts of things, right? And so there was an effort to, try and stabilize, right, and create these, let's say, more cooperative or apologetic regimes to the West specifically, but to capital more generally. And I think those efforts in some interesting ways kind of worked in lockstep. And I think if simultaneously, so imagine, right, the work of the court, they're hearing, they're starting their own cases and responding to court members who are asking them to begin investigations or cases against whomever for whatever, and they're doing this over the years, and you're going after, whatever cases, making these decisions. Well, those decisions are also being made on who's funding your court, which states fund the ICC and which states do not, right? Well, You can imagine who those funders are, right? Right. So that's kind of undergirding your work, but then also as you're doing that work, you're having all of these subpoenas succeed in the global south, while all of them that you're trying to issue in the global north to the powerful countries do not. And so you get a statistical result of that, where the only cases that you have go through, let alone succeed, are again these cases out of the global south, the global east, and so it is again not bias per se, because that would suggest that they were just never trying to issue those other kinds of cases or arrests. Part of the story, not all of the story, right? But yeah, I mean, it like I said before, this is absolutely one of the most fundamental criticisms of the ICC, and it's absolutely legitimate, right? I mean, if you look at its history, it's been very good at going after some kinds of folks and very bad at going after, players from great powers.
So like the people that make up the ICC, are these like presidential appointments? Are they voted? Like how does one actually get to be on the committee? And where is it located at, anyways?
Oh, so it's located primarily in The Hague, right?
Oh,
It has other locations as well, but when we refer to the ICC, or people being put in front of that's why you heard a bunch of people saying like throw them in The Hague or that kind of. So it's in the Netherlands, right? So it's in Northern Europe. So that's where it is. These processes are internal. So people apply, legal professionals and other folks like me who are like area experts and these sorts of things apply to the ICC, apply to the court. The court has internal processes for selecting who becomes like ICC prosecutors and these sorts of things. And you can look up, whoever is appointed at whatever times to be those lead prosecutors. And what you'll find is those prosecutors actually have a great deal of agency in determining the work of the court. And this is why sort of U.S. efforts to put a whole lot of like sanction and political pressure on those individual prosecutors has been such a big news item, right? Because that is actually very, very can be very effective in shaping what the court can and cannot do.
right. And the funding, like, does each country have to contribute a fraction of their whatever?
Well, it's not has to, right? Unfortunately, it's part of their agreements as and if they sign on to the court, right? There are typically financial agreements that each state agrees to in terms of their membership to the court and the court's jurisdiction. So I'm sorry, I'd have to look it up in terms of what those super specifics are, but that's basically how it works, right? That when you sign on to the court as a member state, that there are obligations, rules, and all of the rest, and everybody kind of contributes. Just like other international entities that, by the way, the United States has recently exited. So think sort of in a very similar way as like the WHO, so the World Health Organization. And like, man, if you want to get worried about something that we've done relative to these international organizations, saying we're going to jump out of the WHO and not fund it anymore and all those kinds of things is, wow, a real interesting thing to do as we continue to enter the age of the pandemic, and as we see bird flu starting to take off in the United States. I mean, it is a wildly reckless move. It's very difficult to try and understand, what the end game is there. I mean, it's not as if the amount of funding that we send to the WHO affects in any way, in any meaningful way, our budget or our deficit. We're not going to be saving important funds by doing this. And quite frankly, it was one of the ways that we actually could spread goodwill in the world, right? That one of the few ways left that we were actually just helping people, right? Instead of just constantly coercing them into taking our side. And so I don't know, maybe others understand the move better than I, but some of these just seem like really unforced errors, right? These are real own goals on US empire and influence in the world that could even end up disastrous for our own population, remembering that, again, pandemics are global by definition now. If you don't have global reach, into detecting those pandemics on a very early stage, everybody's at risk. I mean, everybody on Earth is at risk under that scenario. In the same way that if we get rid of, like, as you're going to see with all of my work, right? In the same way that, like, as we get rid of any of our safeguards with regard to nuclear war and warnings and these sorts of things, we are all at risk. I mean, these are things that, you know, some of our ruling and owning classes are doing away with. It's just like, it's a real head scratcher. So, well, what's the end game there? You know what I mean? Like, we all die. You know, it's not even about, like, you know, real politics at that point. That's just like rolling the dice with human civilization, you know?
Man, so this is my last question. What are you most concerned about over the next 4 years? And I know we've probably been alluding to that this whole time, but even just kind of consolidating it, right, and bring it into like one answer. And then what are you hopeful about? Are there any bright spots that you're seeing right now?
So my concerns have to do with the central concerns that, you know, I talk about in my work, which is our overlapping threats to human survival, right? Which, I mean, how can I start anywhere other than that, right? I mean, anything should be secondary to that. So, and why am I concerned about those things given current trends? So when you have an administration saying drill baby drill, we're gonna uncover every possible fossil fuel lease and exploration. We're gonna get it all out. We're gonna do. I mean, that's suicide. I mean, that is for real global suicide. And I can't emphasize that enough. And this is, you know, the reason that you have like climate scientists literally committing suicide, like literally self-emulsifying in public, you know, saying, please listen to us. You know what I mean? They're not doing that for shits and giggles or for clicks, you know, like this is because this is real. So that is terrifying for me. I mean, I am, because what people don't understand is there's points of no return, right? Like you can fuck that up bad enough that it's game over, because these are, right, climate change is accumulation. It's not about rate, right? It's about how much water is in the tub, not about how fast is the water coming out of the faucet. We're almost to the top in the tub. You have to stop the faucet and you have to create a drain on top of that. We are doing the opposite. And again, we're almost about to overflow that tub. And once you do that and you go past certain tipping points, game over. Game over. We're just twiddling our thumbs to apocalypse. So, and I wish I had better news there, but that is the very real reality that people in your audience need to absolutely wake up to and embrace. The second one, of course, is nuclear apocalypse. Entering into this nuclear arms race with China, who does have the capacity to keep their promise, which is to match and probably pass U.S. and Russian stockpiles by 2035, is again like literally just rolling the dice with the future of the planet. And if we don't start getting smart really quickly about slowing down that arms race and creating some new nuclear arms treaties that aren't just between Russia and the United States, but also include China and others, because it's not just China, it's many others as well. We're going to be playing in a very dangerous playground geopolitically for the foreseeable future. Now, where do I have hope? Oddly enough, we talked about earlier, is what gives me hope. I have a great deal of hope in an organized international labor movement and the ability, in part through that movement, but in part through other civil society solidarity and connections, for civil society, for everyday people, for workers in the working class in all countries, to start really pushing back against the oligarchs owning and ruling classes that are essentially the same handful of people that are trying to squeeze every last drop from all the rest of us. And we're seeing some really, really positive signs of that now in the United States and across the world. And in the United States, that is in part manifested in this growing labor movement, this growing union movement across the board, across the country, that is also working toward a potential general strike in 2028 that could also be international. That is the kind of scope and that is the kind of politics that we have to really start thinking about as we face a very powerful class of oligarchs who have clearly and obviously captured state power, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And so you got to have strategies that match what you seek to confront, right? And I don't know how you confront that powerful and that consolidated and owning class without really organized, militant, powerful labor in opposition. And maybe I'm naive. Maybe there's a solution I'm not aware of. And if someone wants to, can show me that, I'll be the first to read that book. But as far as I understand, that's really the very difficult but amazing work ahead of us.
That's really, really cool. Well, Bill, thanks again for stopping by. I mean, I could probably just keep talking to you for several more hours and pick your brain about stuff, but that just gives us more reason to have you back on again. So yeah, thanks for coming by.
I love this. I love this show, fam. I love this show. I love your audience. I love the I mean, for real, fam. I love the structure of your show. I love the sort of the idea of it as well. And for again talking about creating solidarity across party and across communities and culture in the United States, shows like yours is where we got to be.
Yeah.
And I'd say that to all your audience members. I don't care who you voted for. This movement wants you. If you're a working person, whether you realize it or not, you are the fodder of this billionaire class, and we want you as part of this movement.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm gonna have to find a clever way to turn that little section into a clip.
Yeah, that was good.
Have it go viral, plug your book too, and all this other kind of stuff. But yeah. Thanks again, Bill. And thank you to our audience for stopping by. And as always, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Hey, thanks a lot, guys. And happy birthday, Will.
Thanks.